First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. First They Came is a poem that you may have heard before, written by German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller in 1946 after World War II. It is a kind of confession written by Niemöller after he survived his own imprisonment in a Nazi concentration camp. As the website, the Holocaust Memorial Trust, describes Niemöller, it talks about the complicated history that he had, how he initially was an anti-Semitic Nazi supporter, but that over time his views changed when the Nazi propaganda and the Nazi political machine started impacting his ministry, started impacting the German church more than he thought it should. And eventually, again, he was imprisoned for speaking out against the Nazi control in churches. We have to remember that what happened in Germany was sanctified by the Lutheran Church. And people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that you may have heard about, who were a German Lutheran pastor, they broke off. They were the minority. The majority of German Lutheran Christians kind of sat around in the background. And this, I think, is why Martin wrote this poem. This poem continues to remind me, it should remind us, I would say, about the importance of speaking out against injustice when we see it, rather than waiting until it affects us as individuals. To be honest, as a Black person in America, I see injustice quite easily. I'm always attuned to state violence because I know that if the state is being violent towards a minority group in some way, shape, or form, it will come back to impact me. You see, Christian nationalist fascism has a history of unfolding slowly in the West. Political parties often make broad claims when they are seeking majority political power. However, once they achieve this power, most people just expect that the campaign rhetoric will give way to the routine maintenance of governing the country. But what if those in power are more interested in ruling than governing? What if they're not concerned about governing, they just want to exercise their power over us as people, as citizens, as folks who they believe they are responsible and in charge of and should rule? I think the most excessive use of this notion of power was on full display this past week in the shooting and murder of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE officer. And while this is a deeply political conversation, the angle that we want to talk about this shooting that I think is helpful for us on this podcast is to talk about the role that Christian theology, particularly and specifically Christian authoritarianism, has played in the justification of this kind of violence. The ways that Christian doctrine has been used to justify the kind of violence that we see on display right now as a punishment for people's sin, a punishment that's supposed to purify them of their sin. This is a part of our tradition that we have to unpack and we have to unlearn if we are to find a way to move forward. Thanks for joining us. Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians, and not the kind who will call you a domestic terrorist for telling an ICE officer that it's okay and I'm not mad at you. So, if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and I am your host. I am a professor of theology and the lead pastor of the Loft Faith Community in Los Angeles, California. And today I am joined by
Rev Blair.
Hi, it's Everest.
Hey, it's Julia.
It's Wesley.
So, as I said, today we're going to be talking about Christian authoritarianism and the role it has played in the shooting of Renee Nicole Good. Before we really start unpacking this, I just want to first kind of ask y'all, how did you experience the video? Like, how did you experience just the events as they unfolded? How'd you process it?
I mean, not well. I'm pretty sure everyone knew this. This is what we've been anticipating, right? Like, this is what we're moving towards, and this is obviously going to happen. And it's not the first time it's happened, but it happened to a white woman. And I think that's shocking for people. People don't study history, so they don't know, like, I don't know, the Freedom Riders and like what happens historically if you are a white person that challenges white supremacy. Yeah, it's, and people always think that it will never be them and that their whiteness will protect them, but whiteness isn't real. It's a social construct, and the goalposts will always move. And it's just like, I don't know, it sickens me, but here we are. This is what we're doing.
And Julia, I think, this is where whiteness intersects with patriarchy and sexism, right? As you and Blair often mentioned, like, it's no coincidence that it's a white woman who is resisting, right, this kind of Christian nationalist wrapped up in white supremacy, and that a man shoots her, and then after shoots her, I can't use the word because we're still.
He swears at her. He was mad at her. And like, it's also disgusting to see the rhetoric of people trying to justify it, or like, obviously JD Vance, who just can't stop making me sick. Like, I don't have words for him. I find him a vile and despicable creature. And like, the way that he can justify it. But yeah, like, obviously that man was mad that she didn't listen. Obviously it's about compliance. That you've seen now in Minneapolis, all of these men being like, haven't you learned from watching that woman get shot? When people like, it's just like, I hate it. I yield. Yeah. I yield back. There's nothing to say.
Part of the reason this is hitting America so strongly is, as Julia said, because it's a white woman. And that changes the stakes, because we do have racialized hierarchy, and we subconsciously acknowledge that some lives are worth more than others in this country.
Well, and like, that is a protest rule, is usually like white bodies to the front, because we all know that the police are an institution that is made to protect white bodies usually. And so I think that is what is alarming for a lot of people, even like in activist circles, is being like, for so long, the body that the public has been told the police are there to protect more than anything else is white women's bodies. And so seeing this extreme militarized police force shoot a white woman like in cold blood is so like, is kind of this moment of reckoning for a lot of people, I think, consciously or unconsciously, who have held in their minds that is the one type of person that the police will never do that to, which is not good. That's not good. But I think that is like a reason that this is such a like, whoa, things are really, really, really out of control.
Well, and then to protect her whiteness, the powers that be immediately stripped her of her whiteness by naming her a terrorist and an aggressor.
Exactly. I mean, like, exactly what I was going to say. Like, there's a reason, and we're going to get to it later. There's a reason why they called her a terrorist quickly. I also want to say too, Wesley, before you jump in, while I agree that this has become a major story because the woman was white, I think, to me, I'm reminded of what made Bloody Sunday and the March to Selma so powerful, is that there was video, but like, I mean, really, like, the video that you will find in the show notes is a very detailed, frame by frame, multiple angle, like, you're like, this is crazy, right? And then you have, as we said, JD Vance get up immediately and tell a story in a way that is obviously a lie. Like this, I mean, at some point, I feel like you lie so much, maybe you forget you lying. I'm like, you just live in the lie, you know. But all right, before I get going, Wesley, what was your thoughts after you saw the video?
I mean, it was dropped in one of my organizing chats like almost immediately, and it was like, and I think the thing that the person posted was ICE just killed someone in Minneapolis on camera. And to your point, I think that's what, as I watched the video, and I remember sitting with the feelings, I was like, the fact that already immediately this is getting covered just because we have footage of it, that to anyone with a pair of eyes can clearly see the situation for what it was. Not someone in danger, not someone fearing for their life, just someone drunk on power. And it wasn't until after where we learned that it was a white woman, that it was Renee. It blew up beyond what I think the horrors of what ICE has been doing, particularly also because it's happening in Minneapolis. It's a very white city. I mean, it has a large Somali population, but at the same time, it's still in the Midwest. It's still mostly white. And the immediate move to the playbook of marking her as a terrorist and sort of beginning to spin the story, I was like, well, this is what they always do. And I think the thing that I was worried then, and is still very true now, is that there are still so many people who can watch that video and not see what's happening. And that, I think, was like, maybe this will break that spell. I don't know if it is, but I think sort of that's what was sort of going through my head as I first sort of experienced that video.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I think it's important to, and this is why, you know, I did my sermon, and this is a plug for anybody who, I mean, I'm straight up plugging my sermon. I have not done that. I'm like, you know, like I talked about epistemology. Like I think someone in the congregation said I took them to church and to school on Sunday. Because I'm like, no, you need to understand that the way people read things is framed on their sources of knowledge. And if your knowledge source, the way you think, is framed by this notion of patriarchy, this idea that to be disobedient is to be sinful, and therefore your punishment, like you deserve your punishment. Like they didn't release, like what people have to understand is the video that is the most egregious video is the video that the person, the ICE agent, took himself
took with his cell phone. It's not body cam footage.
With his cell phone.
He recorded himself murdering someone.
Like that. It's like making content. Like they literally are like, and I know, I'm telling you, I swear to God, they will, because the way their social media stuff is going, they will use footage from these various things that officers are taking for content on their social media. I'll put any amount of money on it right now. That's what they doing. And that's why you see all these people filming for lots of different reasons. But that's one of the reasons. And so they put that out not to make the ICE officer look innocent, but to make the woman look guilty, to make Renee look guilty because she had the audacity to not obey and comply in the way that people think, the way they think you ought to obey and comply. Everest, I know there's something you want to say.
I was just going to say, can you define epistemology for the non-PhD listeners?
Sorry. Yeah, I meant to do that. When I talk about epistemology, what I'm saying is the sources that you draw from that you call knowledge, right? So the way in which you are thinking, how you engage the world, the resources you use, even the way you view those resources, right? That's why I talk about patriarchal epistemology, meaning that if you view the knowledge that you have through the lens of patriarchy, right, you're going to look at things in such a way that it can justify and normalize violence. And by that, I mean, if you read the Bible with the framework of a patriarchal framework, you're going to read it in ways that's going to reinforce patriarchal norms, right? So epistemology is really just a study of knowledge. Like it's a study of how you know what you know. And so much of what we've been taught, you know, I remember I always ask people this question. I'm teaching anti-racism. When did you learn about Black people in America? What did you start with? Or when you learn about Black people, what did you start with? And it's either slavery or the civil rights. And I'm like, it erases thousands of years of African history. Like we just got here when we became slaves, right? That's what I mean by epistemology. Julia?
How is that different than hermeneutics?
It's so a hermeneutic is a way in which you approach the lens that you use to approach certain sources, right? So
Okay.
I have a liberationist hermeneutic. And so when I read the Bible, I read it through the lens of liberation. And I know we gotta have an episode on liberation theology, on feminists. We need to have an episode. We need to have like a whole separate session on like school, basically.
Yeah, we can give people different lenses to use as they deconstruct and reconstruct.
Yeah. But I don't want to get too far off track before we without because I know that can happen before pulling us back. I know Blair, you had mentioned that it's important for us to note. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about this. The fact that this is not the first ICE shooting. That last year was the deadliest year, if I'm not mistaken, of ICE shootings.
Right. The Trace, which is an organization that reports on all kinds of gun violence, has done reporting on ICE gun use. There have been 15 incidents since 2015, or I'm sorry, since 2025, that people have been held at gunpoint by ICE agent. 16 incidents in which they've opened fire. 3 people have been shot observing or documenting immigration raids. 5 people have been shot while driving away from traffic stops or evading an enforcement action. And one of the most egregious of those was in October of 2025. Marimar Martinez, who is a Latina woman, had her car rammed into while she was trying to observe ICE agents and warn her community that ICE was in the neighborhood. The ICE agents rammed into her car, and an agent shot her 5 times with an assault rifle. And she survived. She's an American citizen. And they tried to bring charges of assault against her as if she had rammed into the ICE agents' cars. And video evidence surfaced that led to them dropping the charges, but they have not succeeded in bringing charges against the agent who shot her. And that's already happened, right? So back in October, and maybe we didn't hear as much about it because she survived or because she's a brown woman or both. This is not the first incident of a shooting of an innocent bystander that was caught on video.
Well, and that video, the video of her car getting hit, is also so terrifying and disturbing. And that is where what Wesley said, that people cannot see what they are seeing. That was the first time that I had a lot of people around me, older folks mostly, being like, well, what did she do? Like, surely she did something. And I think as more and more videos are surfacing of just unprovoked violence and control, it is like, I wonder what it will take for people to accept that there is no provocation necessary, and that we are like moving into a time when violence is just enacted upon people, and it is just what's happening, which I guess is not entirely new. But
I think I want to toss it to Wesley, but one thing I wanted to say, and we're going to get into this, Everest, because I was wrestling with this too. I do think this is tied up to notions of sin and salvation, but then the way we have politicized, literally, like made this a political concept, sin and salvation. So our first instinct is that they sinned, they did something wrong, and this is a deserved punishment. And that's a default response that so many of us have had because we've been conditioned to have that response because the way our state is constructed is deeply tied to religion. Wesley?
Yeah, I think what your comment, Everest, made me think of is we've had decades upon decades of socialization that, I mean, we start with the premise of guilty until innocent until proven guilty, but no one really believes that, because the moment a cop accuses you of something, you're guilty in some way. And we have movies, shows, books that just continue to tell the lie that because a police officer does something, they have to have been justified in whatever they're doing, and therefore the person on the other end of it is somehow automatically guilty. And I mean, I think we haven't yet figured out that there's an incentive structure on the police side, on the enforcement side, on ICE's side, that is not centering human flourishing and centering something else, protection of property, whatever you want to call it. And so we still give this like benefit of the doubt to police when we shouldn't be. And I think that's also why it's making it difficult to like for people to see ICE as something other than, an occupying force.
So when we were trying to figure out how to talk about this, episode, and I wanted to find a way to talk about, or how I should say, when we were trying to figure out how to produce and design an episode, because originally this was going to be our Q&A episode. We're going to do something light. We're like, hey, everybody been on vacation. Let's just come back and do something we can ease into it. But I wanted to talk about this because I felt like we needed to discuss it while it's still on people's minds. Julia, you, I think, gave me the language I was looking for to figure out how to discuss this. So I want to kind of toss it over to you, because I think you named it in this. I think you said in the group chat, people's obsession with authority. I can't remember exactly what you said, but something like that. You're like, why do people think you did this obsession with following authority, and how it's tied to what's happening? Yeah, I'll let you say more. Go ahead.
Well, I just think that it's so crazy in a country, in a nation that says that it values freedom, what that means to people, and how deeply the idea of like compliance to authority is ingrained. And I think from what I observe, especially in the white community, like I think for Black people, it's different. I mean, I grew up like you question those things because so many rules are created with the intention of harming or oppressing you, or like limiting your speech, or limiting your ability to move freely. And so I just think of it differently, but it will never not astound me the ways in which white Americans believe in complying to authority, like unquestioned.
When they actually don't have to. Like, there is a myth that's like, if you just complied, you would have been okay. But that same standard does not actually apply to white Americans.
It doesn't apply to anyone. But
it
it's
doesn't
like,
apply to anyone.
And that, but like that, the need to believe that it does is so deeply entrenched in like, they're like the most, like in the white supremacist conditioning, like you have to believe that like there's, I don't know. It's just a thing that I've observed. I don't like it.
I guess I think it does apply to white people, because when they comply, they usually live. What we're seeing now is the breakdown of that societal contract. Think about how many active shooters who are white survive, but a Black or brown person selling a cigarette doesn't survive. Like,
I guess it's that compliance looks different. Like the standard of what compliance has to be to keep yourself safe looks different. Where like you can be a white man, like you said, that has just murdered a lot of people, and then if you just put your hands up, you'll be taken into custody safely, and Black bodies usually do not get that luxury. So I guess that I'm like, I guess the standard applies, but the what compliance is supposed to look like and what the window of tolerance is much larger,
because it's about upholding. Are you challenging the status quo, and are you challenging patriarchy and white supremacy? If you are not, then don't worry about it. But if you are, then your whiteness will not save you. That to me is the difference. Like if you're complying, but you're doing something to harm, like if you're shooting up a grocery store in a Black neighborhood and you comply with police, they're totally fine with that. If you go into a church and shoot a bunch of Black people, like they'll take you to McDonald's afterwards. That's fine.
I think, Julia, it's also, it is an epistemological difference. It's how white people are taught to know about authority and how everyone else is taught to know about authority. That, as you said, when you were being raised, you were not taught to trust authority figures or the law. White people are absolutely taught to trust authority figures and the law. When I was growing up, I was told, if you're in trouble, find a police officer. I don't teach my kids that because I know that's not actually true. That police officers are not necessarily the safest person to go to. And that is something I had to learn from communities of color, and something I had to learn how to teach to my children from Black mothers. We talk about, quote unquote, the talk. In white communities, that means the first time you talk about sex with your kids. In Black communities, that means the first time you talk about why police officers can't be trusted and what you need to do to keep from being murdered on the street by authority figures. Same phrase, two completely different ideas of what that means. and what is necessary to stay safe in this world. And that is an epistemological difference where we have two Americas. We do have two different experiences of what hierarchy and authority mean in this country.
I want to say that I actually, I know Wesley, you mentioned how there's all these, TV shows and movies and stuff like that give us a particular framework of police. What I did is I inverted that because Isaiah used to watch Paw Patrol.
Patrol.
Man, and I was like, I was
Culprit
like,
number one. Start 'em
every
young.
time I'm like, so exactly. I was like, what's happening?
Propaganda.
Let's examine this. So I'm like having them analyze it and be like, see, you can't trust, like you just gotta invert it.
But if we have decided as a society that a 10-year-old and a bunch of puppies have the authority to invoke and uphold the law, then white people say, okay, let's trust the 10-year-old and this group of puppies.
Yeah.
Unquestioningly. Which
Yeah.
is insane.
Not my house. No, I want to transition us to move to the theology, because I think this is helpful in as much as it kind of, because Julia, I think where I slightly disagree with you is I do think insofar as patriarchy is a part of the framework in which compliance is taught to all people, to all Christians. There is a way in which this is in the Black community as well. It just does not also extend to state authority. We are definitely taught the question of state authority, but patriarchy in male authority and just authority in general, even within Black churches and Black community, because patriarchy is so pervasive. And by patriarchy, I'm talking about institutionalized sexism, right? The ways in which we are taught to think about gender, sex, and sexuality, and how that becomes institutionalized in how we think and talk and what it is that we do and what we believe. So to be clear, what I wanted to do, as we were trying to think about this, I went back to the book that we actually talked to the author earlier, Andrew Crinks, in his book, White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism, and the Religious Function of Mass Criminalization, because I do believe that the way Dr. Crinks describes sin and salvation helps us understand why authority is so important in these conservative spaces. So when he's talking about these concepts, it's fundamentally different than the way I think about sin and salvation now as a progressive Christian. So Crinks writes on page 125 in his book, while understandings of what precisely sin and salvation entail vary across Christian thought, a predominant trajectory within Christian theology interprets sin and salvation in terms of human obedience and subjection to divine authority that properly reflects the radical difference in power and ontology between humans and God. Sin is understood as disobedient refusal to be subject to the benevolent, life-giving authority, while salvation is understood to entail obedient return to subjection to that authority. Now, this to me was shocking. And I remember there's a comment on our YouTube page, I had to be a few weeks ago, where somebody was talking to, one commenter that I think probably wasn't a bot, I don't know, where they said, well, a common understanding of sin is disobedience to an authority. And I'm just like,
Common for who?
that's what I thought. I'm like, I've never had one person tell me this is what sin is disobeying authority. But then as again, we're thinking about this, I'm like, oh, so the title of this chapter that I'm referring to in Crinks' book is called The Mortal God of Police Power. And he describes in this chapter how we have given police a kind of, they become the function of God's will and punishment on people for committing sins by being disobedient. That's basically the gist of this chapter. And I had never thought about the way we think about police in that way, but it fundamentally makes sense when you have this concept of sin as disobeying authority, if you believe that authority has been put in place by God. And so he has another quote on here where he's talking about, he says, as legal scholar John Witt Jr. writes, early modern Protestant jurists and theologians, so a jurist is a lawyer, and theologians regularly collaborated in formulating criminal doctrines and inflicting criminal punishments, and were unified in the belief that God imposes divine punishments and that civil magistrates are God's vice-regents who carry out God's will in the world. This was their thinking. These lawyers and judges are doing God's will by punishing people and correcting them to have good, quote unquote, behavior, purging their sin. So in this way, it makes sense in some of these people's mind that you can get shot, right? This is why you see, when you see black folks getting recorded getting shot, they're like, oh, well, what were they doing wrong? Even in the protest marches, they're like, well, you're not supposed to be gathered on those streets, right? Like, there's some at some point it breaks, as Julia, as you mentioned, the Freedom Riders was a critical point of this, because you got these, I'm like, and I mean, if you haven't been to the Rosa Parks Museum, if you haven't been to the Equal Justice Initiative Museum in Alabama, you need to go, because this is where I'm like, this is why Everest, Blair, I'm like, shout out to the good whites. I'm like, 'cause some folks was out here doing the work. I mean, they were, doing the work that needed to get done. And it would not have happened had it not been for white people deciding to put their life on the line. And I'm thinking firstly of, I think Eugene Debs was his name. He was murdered. I'll put a link to this amazing podcast I listened to called White Lies, where it talks about how his murder while he was down there protesting in Montgomery, a Unitarian Universalist minister, basically was a turning point in the civil rights movement, because of that no one was held accountable. And it was this white dude from the Northeast, and people were just like, all right, we've got to shift. And so, yeah, Blair, I'm really interested in how you think, how as a pastor, or even as a person who grew up in, Christian, obviously, this notion of sin and how it can contribute to what we're seeing. I'm not sure if that's what you want to talk about, but that's what I was about to ask you.
No, it is what I want to talk about. And what I want to say about this framework of theology is point devoid of grace.
100%.
It's completely devoid of grace. It's not Christian. Like the whole point of Jesus, even within the framework of this rigid hierarchical understanding of divine punishment, is that Christ came to absolve us of our sin so that we do not have to perform the law perfectly. In this framework that you and Crinks are describing, you have to execute perfectly the laws that have been placed before you in order to earn salvation. But the whole point of Jesus is mercy and grace when we inevitably fail to execute the law perfectly, and particularly the law of love, to love one another as Christ loved us. And it drives me insane that folks who are so focused on talking about having a personal relationship with Jesus fail to recognize the lack of grace in their own theology. It's also really important to me that in Chicago, we have seen pastors come out to the front lines, and they are speaking to ICE agents, inviting them to repent and offering them the reminder of grace, that grace is obvious. And even before they shot Renee Good in the face, she said, I'm not mad at you. Like, she literally offered a moment of grace, and that was met with deadly force.
It just makes me so sad, because what this implies people think of God. And it's also, to me, like inherently sinful to like reject that grace. It's offered to you and you don't even want it. Like, what does that say? Like, what does that mean? Like, how do you even get to that place where you're over here, you want to talk about like Christ, and like you wear t-shirts, but you don't even understand the most basic tenet of God's love. How are you a Christian?
I mean, I think this is where it's helpful for us to understand that so much of contemporary Christianity, you're always trying to disentangle it from state power. And this honestly goes back, most people practice Constantinian Christianity. Progressive Christianity is the religion of Jesus. What we're fighting against is Constantinian Christianity. It's Christianity baptized by state power. It's tied to the maintenance and preservation of power. This is why it's telling you to be afraid. Jesus wasn't preaching this theology of fear. Jesus was preaching a theology of love and relationship with God that transforms how you relate to yourself and how you relate to your neighbor. Jesus was preaching a theology of solidarity, a theology that invites you to sit with those who are suffering to undo the conditions that created the problems in the first place. That is the religion of Jesus. What we see these people talking about is the religion of Constantine. It is the religion that Augustine helped put together, that then Anselm gives them the framework of Wesley, what's it called? We always talk about that penal substitution atonement.
My favorite.
Yeah, I know.
Define it, please.
Well, I mean, it's just substitutionary atonement is. I mean, people who listen to this podcast know that we've talked about this enough. Basically, that just means that somebody had to die and suffer for your salvation, right? Which makes absolutely
It's
no
crazy.
sense.
The idea that death is required. Like
Exactly.
someone
Yeah.
has.
No,
Yeah, it's a.
I mean, this is. I have it right here because I have this. Krink's book. He's talking about for Anselm to sin. Anselm argues is to refrain from giving God the honor that God is owed. And so, in this sense, he talks about justice is about preservation of order. He's like, for Anselm, as for Augustine, one of God's most basic traits is that God is just, which is for Anselm has to do with a sense of order and proportionality. So, if you do not recognize order in ways in which it's supposed to be meted out by God, then you'll be punished and you owe God something for the disorderly conduct of which you have. I want to say something about Calvin, and then I want to actually head us to the break so we can get to so we can move to talking about how this is being played out in the rest of the world. For these folks, the root of sin is disobedience, fundamentally, right? It's disobedience to their notion of power. And this is why what they try to do is not so much prove themselves right, but is to show that the people who are the agitators, the people who are resisting oppression, the people who are resisting this state violence, we are committing a sin because we are being disobedient, right? That we are too prideful, right, to actually comply to the law. And so because of our unwillingness to comply, what's happening to us is just because the police and the military, as we're going to talk about next, has been given a kind of religious authority as to the maintenance of order. Order is thus seen as sovereign, as what is holy, and rather than the preservation of order in this sense requires the preservation of white supremacy, of patriarchy, all these other kind of things. Because when people talk about law and order, they really mean order, preserving the order of power and using laws to help preserve that, right? That's what's been happening. And so this leads to this notion of salvation, where salvation is understood as subjugation and being subject to God. And this is where, Blair, you were right in the framing of, for these folks, salvation isn't tied to grace or relationship, right? It's just literally tied to being subject. And because of that, it creates a space for fear, right? For fear to be the guiding force rather than love, because you're always worried about, am I being subject enough? Am I doing things the correct way? Rather than trusting in grace in the relationship and love as it unfolds to guide you to listen to that love. And I think it leads us to the point we are right now. I know I've said a lot. I know I said I want to go to break, but I know, Everest, I haven't given you the space to say anything, so I want to make sure I see if there's something you want to say before we roll out.
Well, I just feel pissed, and I also feel like it's not your business. Like, even the thing that you're saying, even if all of those things were true and the God that we believed in had like no grace and no space for forgiveness and that still would not be our job. Like, I feel like the Bible is still, and Jesus is pretty clear about being like, that's God's business, that's not your business, a little bit. So I'm like, all of the theology that you're describing is very different from what I believe. I believe in a extremely graceful God. I believe that the core of the story of Jesus is about redemption and grace for all people. But even if that wasn't true, I feel like this like punitive punishing, we get to decide who does and does not deserve salvation, is still so far from anything that is biblically based. Like, us getting to play God in that way also is so.
And you just named it, Everest. You just named it. Like, and I said it on Sunday. When we read these stories in the Bible, rather than seeing ourselves in the humans in the Bible, like I talked about Moses and Miriam, people see themselves as God. And that's the problem, right? And so I want to wrap up this segment by just, again, quoting a couple lines from Krink's book, where he says, for Augustine, civil government exists because sin does. Human sinfulness, unrestrained inevitability leads to chaos and evil. And this is the way in which they think. So he goes on to say, additionally, if punishment is natural, a self-willed consequence of disrupting sacred social order, then the technologies of the state, handcuffs, squad cars, razor wire, concrete walls, surveillance technology, and weaponry are naturally occurring and divinely willed phenomena. And so this is kind of where he's talking about, right? This is how we get here. If your notion of salvation is tied to state power, it's going to require people to be treated this way and incarcerated in order to preserve, right, the kind of order that people believe is tied to God, right, that is holy. So I know this is heavy. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and talk about how this ties to like more long-term broad legal thinking with respect to just war theory. Thanks for listening to the Progressive Christians podcast. If you are watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you are watching or listening, I should say, on Apple or Spotify, please rate and subscribe and leave a comment, especially if you're doing this on Spotify. As you know, those of you who do, we always respond to those comments. If you've been listening, you know that we're excited that we are going to be having some subscriber exclusive content that's going to be beginning in February. We have some ideas for what that content can look like. We really want to hear from you. So if you have ideas about what you would like us to create, additional things you'd like us to talk about, stuff that could just be subscriber only, please email us at theprogressivechristians@theloftla.org and let us know. Welcome back to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm the capital kind. So we are continuing our conversation about the shooting of Renee Nicole Good, but we wanted to, at least as we move towards the latter part of the podcast, begin to frame this within a broader context of how Christian theology began to justify violence. Because initially, this was a huge deal, right? Like people could not serve in the military and people couldn't serve the state, if you will, if they were Christian, which is one of the reasons why Christianity was resisted by the Roman Empire. And this shift actually was necessary for this to become the religion of the state. But I know, Blair, I want to turn this over to you to kind of guide us through this part of the conversation.
What we are watching play out right now is so outrageous. And it takes a lot of energy to want to understand the thought process of people who are defending it. But I do think it's important because that's the only way we can really turn the tide without more violence from both sides. But there are ethical frameworks within murder that within them, murder on the street is justified. And there's one theory that we talk about in Christian ethics called just war theory. And within just war theory, basically, Christians had to figure out, is there ever a time when murdering each other on the street is what we have to do? And so essentially, these ethical principles that justify violence and acts of war were developed over time by a lot of different ethicists and thinkers. And over the overview of just war theory is that it should only be engaged as a last resort. All nonviolent options should be exhausted first. A war is only just if it's waged by a legitimate authority. So even within just war theory, there's an expectation of authority as correct. A just war should only be fought to redress a wrong suffered. So it is not a just war if you are the instigator, but it is a just war if you're responding to violence. A war should only be fought if there's a reasonable chance of success. It should only be fought to reestablish peace, not to punish the enemy. The actions of violence should be proportional to the injury suffered. And the weapons should discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. So in the minds of people who support ICE and the actions that are being carried out by the federal government right now, I do believe they have come to understand the response to civil violations of immigration as justified under just war theory. Because the government, the authority, has framed it that way from a theological perspective. When we conflate the nationalist authority with the religious holiness and authority, it becomes very easy to do. And so this is why they've been arguing that they have to go against immigrants because immigrants are ruining our country, because they're taking jobs, because they're murdering people, because they're bringing drugs on the streets, right? All of these things are justifications to try and help people do the mental gymnastics that allow them to violate their own humanity and cause violence against other humans and to dehumanize others. And so they have conflated the theological justification of the religious right with this just war theory. And they're going to continue to do so more and more. We've already seen them do it. It is a reply, right? We talked about they had to name Renee Good as a terrorist in order to justify this violence. And also, they understand that they're waging a holy war, and a holy war is always justified, is always a just war. Because if you believe you are in the place of God or a representative of God, and something is trying to control or violate your understanding of the holy order, then you are going to consider yourself justified to use violence to push back against that disorder. And that's exactly what we're watching play out right now on the national scale.
How do they reconcile their hatred with immigrants with what Christ says about immigrants?
They don't read the Bible. That's the only honest answer.
Yeah.
And if anything, if they're thinking about they're thinking about immigrants who did it the right way. And the whole narrative around these ICE raids is that these people didn't do it the right way. They are criminals. Like they undercut that the Bible's immigrant argument by creating a new definition. Immigrant isn't just someone who came here. It's, did they do it correctly? Did they follow the process?
Well, the thing is that they do read the Bible. That actually, like, I feel like there's some people whose interpretations of the Bible seem very non-critical and non-culturally informed and historically informed to me. But people are reading the Bible. I think it's really easy for us to be like, they're just eating what they're being spoon-fed. There's no thought going on. But like, people actually are reading the Bible and telling themselves that this is biblically justified and holy. I think that on what Wesley said, there is a like cognitive break happening between biblical times and now. That is something that I've heard a lot, is like borders were just different. Empire was different. The social order was different, which is so funny because that is not universally applied. But I think that as far as immigration goes, I have heard the argument made like, yeah, in that time, certain things were looked at this way, but Jesus just could not have imagined America, this God-ordained nation that we need to gatekeep. I don't know.
Yeah, Jesus was God. So, but Jesus couldn't imagine this anyway. Wesley?
But also, to that point, I think there's also just like a false understanding of what immigration looked like for when their white ancestors came through. And so like this, like we did it the right way. It was like, there were no rules. Like it was open borders. You could come here if you wanted to. And now you hold over this, well, we did it the right way. They're not doing it the right way. It's like, that's just a false narrative. But again, it would require people to being literate. And I don't know that that's where we're at now.
And the current system is impossible. People don't understand. Not only when their ancestors came, there were no rules and they were just stealing land willy-nilly without a permit, but also the current immigration system. I think very few people have actually done research into what it looks like to do it the right way in this day and age. Even, I mean, not even in this current moment, but even like for the last several decades, it has been damn near impossible to immigrate correctly. So it makes me so angry because people say that, but they have no idea what they're talking about.
But even when people do it correctly right now, they aren't allowing them to become citizens. They were just saying, I don't even remember what state it is, and just this last week, people who have done everything correctly, the White House said, sorry, we're not going to let you be citizens at their ceremony.
Yep.
And they're getting detained at appointments, and they're getting detained at ceremonies. Yeah, it's so absurd.
Yeah,
These are all people who are doing it the right way.
And so, but I want to go back to Everett's point and Blair's point about, are they reading the Bible? Are they not reading the Bible? I do think it's both. Some people are not reading the Bible. They just say they're Christian. Some people are reading the Bible, but this is what we talked about, hermeneutics, right? Their lens, their hermeneutic, the lens which they read in the Bible is Christian nationalist. The lens is white supremacist, and the lens is patriarchal, right? The lens is such that it prioritizes order. What they don't understand is how their ancestors came here as a tool of disorder. So any white ancestor that came here, especially before the late 1800s, so unless your people came here in the early 1900s, they came here to dispossess indigenous people from their land. They were invited here intentionally. The Homestead Act invited European immigrants here intentionally to take the land of indigenous and what we would now call Latinx folks, right, in the West. And so the right way was already done violently in there from this perspective. And I think this is what as I know, Julia, at some point we got to do a podcast. I don't know how, maybe this needs to be one of the first paywall podcast. I'm like, about literacy. Cause I'm like, they don't read. Cause I'm like, read a book.
They can't read.
Watch a movie. I'm like, there's documentaries on this stuff. I'm like, but this is why they defund PBS. I'm like, how much stuff do they have to create for us to, and this is about, again, to the frustrating part, having gone to South Africa and see what happens if you create a museum that tells the story the correct way, how powerful it can be. You're just like, wow, this is how things unfolded. I didn't know it was like this. This is the last thing I want to say. And this sounds, I don't want to sound alarmist, but I need to be honest. There was no band marching down the streets in Berlin to announce the Holocaust. It just happened. There will be no for those of you who are waiting to say, well, I want to know when things are bad before I know it's like, there is no announcement. It just happens. It unfolds. It is a matter of when we're willing to stand up and resist, right? And so we have reached that point, and I think that this is why they do care so much about censorship, Everest, and I think we need to name that. I want to, before we wrap up, I know we've been trying to have some good news on here. And I want to make sure we at least spend some time at least ending with some good news, because, and I mean, there's any number of good news that we could talk about with respect to Zoran Mamdani. That was what we want to lift up in times, how he stood with striking nurses, working with New York governor. He's standing with striking nurses, which is amazing because they're demanding a fair wage. He's also already within like a week or 2 weeks of being in office, beginning to deliver universal child care. I think for 3-year-olds now, and it's
down to 2-year-olds.
And like he
down
did
to 2-year-olds in New York City, and then across the state, every child under 5. They're trying to fund childcare, public childcare for every child under 5.
And this is how you know, like, this stuff is possible. And Wesley, I'm gonna toss it to you. This stuff is possible if you want to make it happen. And so when you look at what has it happened, if you live in a red state and they're like, oh, government can't, like it. If you live in a red state, everything that you don't have, blame the appropriate people, because they're the people in power not doing stuff. Wesley?
Yeah, when they tell you that government moves slow, when some things are not possible, that's not true. We're seeing what's possible when someone cares about the people that they lead. So blame your politicians, vote them out, primary them, and in terms of ICE, at least have a whistle. Find a way to alert your community with a whistle.
One of the things I want to say as we wrap up, Julie, I was going to give you the last words, since this was your framing, or at least give you the invitation to say something. These ICE agents are undertrained, and so we do need to be careful. I'll put a link in the show notes. They getting people who've only been barely been through high school, and they are vast. Some of them can't read. They had to keep reducing the time that people have to spend in training so they could get enough people on the streets. So these are uneducated folks who just are doing it for some money, right? And so I'm not telling you to put your life on the line for, what I'm inviting you to do is to recognize the risk, but to understand we need to take risks. That this is the time for we need to take risk is now. And I'm not doing that without recognizing that I myself am also putting myself out there. Julie, is there anything you want to say as the framer of the conversation? So helpful.
I mean, listen,
as
I
you
can't
were?
say much. I left the country. So like like I understand that it's like, oh, Julia is sitting on her throne across the sea, but like I do think I beg of you, just read books. Even the conversation that we were just having about church history, like take the time to consider the context of the things that you believe, like what you've been conditioned. Like there is a reason that these frameworks exist, and it's not because Christ said that they should. Like it's just not. And if you just look a little bit, you might be shocked at what you find. And if you do have this relationship with God where you believe that God is authoritative and is going to punish you and like all of these, like that is a thing to believe, but you also don't have to believe that. And like there's plenty of evidence to believe other things. And when I say we, I mean Reverend Blair and Reverend Carter, they can help you find resources and like find other ways of considering and understanding and unpacking and deconstructing and reconstructing some of the things that you've been taught that might not sit well with your soul.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Wesley, Blair, and Everest, for honestly just this conversation was needed. I needed to think about this theologically because it's just so heavy. Like I have literally not been able to sleep because I don't know what to do. That's how I feel. I want to do everything and I don't necessarily know what that looks like. So sorry.
But also, can I say, read Renee's poems. That is a queer woman. That is a poet. That is a mother. It just sounds like she was a really incredible person. I think we are like talking about all of these really heavy, abstract things, and I keep coming back to being like, that is just a person, and all of the people that have been harmed are people that are in communities and in families, and the reason that it is our Christian duty to talk about these things and care about them is because these are our neighbors and our brothers and sisters and siblings that are being harmed and taken away from us well before their time.
Yeah.
And so
no, Everest, that's a great point. I'll try to find the link and put it in the show notes. She went to Roman Catholic University. Like she was a Christian. Like she wrote from a Christian perspective. And it's so obvious when you read it. You're like, oh, this person was a Christian. So thank you for joining us for the Progressive Christian Podcast. The Progressive Christian Podcast is a ministry of the Loft, a Westwood community of Westwood United Methodist Church. If you'd like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on all social media platforms at The Progressive Christians. If you have any questions or comments, we'd like to hear from you please email us, progressivechristians@theloftla.org. Our show is produced by our amazing producer, Spencer, and is mixed and edited by our wonderful audio engineer, AJ. If you like the show, again, please rate, review, share, and subscribe on whatever platform you are listening. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye.
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 Bye.